The smell of roasting turkey, usually a comforting herald of a chaotic but familiar family gathering, had curdled into something acrid, something I couldn't quite place. It clung to the air, thick and cloying, like the unspoken words that always seemed to hover around my father. He cleared his throat, a sound that always preceded an announcement, and my stomach did its usual anticipatory clench. "I've made a decision," he began, his voice unnaturally smooth, as if he were discussing the weather. "The business is sold. Completely. And, as a thank you for her support during this process, and as a gift, I've made sure Sarah is taken care of." He gestured vaguely towards my sister, who was already beaming, her eyes darting towards her new, diamond-studded watch. My own breath hitched, caught somewhere between disbelief and a cold, creeping dread. The hum of the refrigerator, the clink of silverware as Aunt Carol set the table, the distant laughter of my cousins, it all faded into a dull roar, a soundtrack to the moment my world tilted on its axis. I'd spent years meticulously tending to the seedlings of that business, nurturing it through lean times and celebrating its modest victories, all with the unspoken understanding that it was our legacy, a tangible piece of our family's history. Now, it was just a transaction, a final piece of the puzzle rearranged to suit my father's convenience, and Sarah's insatiable appetite. Life with my father had always been a masterclass in selective blindness. He was a man who saw only what he wanted to see, and conveniently overlooked the rest. For years, the business, a modest but respected regional manufacturer of custom cabinetry, was the unspoken king of our household. It dictated our holidays, our vacations, and, most importantly, our conversations. My father, Mr. Henderson Sr., was its benevolent dictator. He'd built it from the ground up, a testament to his grit, or so he told us. And we, his children, were expected to admire, to aspire, to eventually inherit. Sarah, ever the golden child, had always been groomed for the softer, administrative side. I, on the other hand, had always been elbow-deep in the workshops, learning the craft, understanding the machinery, the grain of the wood, the meticulous balance of precision and artistry. I'd poured myself into it, finding a quiet satisfaction in the tangible results of my labor. My father would often nod approvingly, a rare flicker of genuine pride in his eyes, before invariably steering the conversation back to his own achievements. "Good work, son," he'd say, his hand resting on my shoulder, a weight that felt both supportive and suffocating. "But remember, it's all about the numbers. The bottom line." There was the summer I turned 22. I'd proposed a significant, yet calculated, expansion into a new market. I'd spent months on the proposal, market research, financial projections, even sketches of new designs. I'd presented it to him with a nervous excitement, genuinely believing it was the next logical step for the company. He'd listened, his face impassive, then dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Too much risk, Michael. Sarah's been talking about updating the office. We need to focus on internal improvements. Keeping things comfortable." Comfortable. The word tasted like ash. Sarah, who had never once set foot in the workshop, whose understanding of manufacturing extended to knowing which printer ink cartridges to order, was dictating the company's strategic direction. I remembered seeing her that evening, showing off a new designer handbag to our mother, her voice bright with oblivious self-importance. It was then I started to understand that my father's support was conditional, a placid river flowing in a direction he decreed, not one that necessarily benefited the collective. Then there was the bankruptcy scare, 2 years ago. The industry was hit hard by a sudden downturn. We were teetering. I'd worked 17-hour days, renegotiating supplier contracts, streamlining production, even taking on personal debt to keep the lights on. My father had mostly retreated to his study, surfacing only to offer platitudes and ask if the checks were still being cashed. Sarah, meanwhile, had been preoccupied with planning an extravagant engagement party, a fate that seemed to be funded by the very company we were desperately trying to save. I saw the invoices, the exorbitant catering bills, the florist's charges. When I'd quietly asked about them, my father had simply said, "A little bit of normalcy is good for morale, son. We can't let the stress consume us." Morale. For whom? Not for me, who was losing sleep and sanity. Not for the long-time employees I was terrified of laying off. But Sarah's impending marriage, it seemed, was more important than the livelihoods of 20 people and the continuation of a business that had been in our family for 3 generations. The day of the announcement, the AI. R in the dining room was thick with an artificial cheerfulness. The roast turkey sat center stage, a golden monument to abundance that felt, in retrospect, like a cruel jest. My father, dressed in his usual crisp white shirt, cleared his throat. "I've made a decision," he announced, his voice carrying over the polite murmur of conversation. "The business is sold. Completely. And, as a thank you for her support during this process, and as a gift, I've made sure Sarah is taken care of." He gestured, a casual flick of his wrist, towards Sarah. She was already mid-beam, her newly acquired diamond bracelet catching the light. My stomach plummeted. The cutlery seemed to freeze in mid-air. The distant sound of laughter from the garden ceased. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my chest. This wasn't a discussion. This wasn't a proposal. This was a pronouncement. He hadn't spoken to me about it. Not a single word. He'd sold the one thing I'd poured my life into, the one thing I believed was meant for me, and given the proceeds, the very essence of my father's legacy, to Sarah. He hadn't even bothered to ask my opinion. It was as if I, and all my years of dedication, were entirely irrelevant. The air in the room seemed to thin, leaving me breathless. Sarah, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring within me, was already recounting the story of how Dad had generously decided to include her in his financial planning, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that made my teeth ache. My father, meanwhile, was beaming, the proud architect of his own grand deception. He met my gaze for a fleeting second, a flicker of something I couldn't decipher, pity? Triumph? Before turning back to the adoring faces around the table. The silence that followed my father's announcement was not a peaceful one. It was a vacuum, sucking out the air, leaving a suffocating void. Sarah chirped about future vacations, about how she could finally afford that vintage car she'd been eyeing. My mother, bless her well-meaning heart, patted my arm and said, "It's all right, dear. You'll find something else. Find something else." As if my life's work, my passion, could simply be replaced like a worn-out tool. I felt a tremor run through me, a deep, primal tremor of betrayal. It wasn't just the financial loss, though that was significant. It was the erasure. The complete and utter dismissal of my contributions, my dedication, my very identity. The years spent in the heat of the workshop, the calloused hands, the smell of sawdust embedded in my skin, all reduced to nothing. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, constricted. I watched my father, the architect of this particular brand of quiet devastation. He was a man who believed in the illusion of control, in the carefully curated narrative of his own benevolence. He expected gratitude, not questions. He expected obedience, not rebellion. And I, foolishly, had always believed my work, my loyalty, would speak for itself. I was wrong. My work had spoken, and my father had simply chosen not to listen. The drive home was a blur. The familiar streets seemed alien, the streetlights like accusatory spotlights. I replayed the scene in the dining room, dissecting every word, every glance. The casual way he dismissed my entire future. The smug satisfaction on Sarah's face. The suffocating embrace of my father's manufactured generosity. I felt a cold clarity descend. This wasn't about anger anymore. Anger was loud, messy, and ultimately, ineffective. This was about something far more precise, far more enduring. The next morning, the smell of brewing coffee was the only thing that felt normal. I'd slept poorly, my mind a battlefield of replays and replans. I walked into my father's study, the room that had always been off-limits, the sanctum of his pronouncements. He was there, reviewing spreadsheets, the very documents that had once represented my potential future. He looked up, a flicker of annoyance at the intrusion, quickly masked by his practiced smile. "Morning, son. Something on your mind?" I didn't answer directly. Instead, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single, thick manila envelope. I placed it on his desk, the sound of it landing on the polished mahogany a small, sharp punctuation mark. "What's this?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. I met his gaze, and for the first time, I let him see the cold resolve that had solidified within me overnight. "It's the deed of trust for the business," I said, my voice calm, even. "The one you created when you gifted it to Sarah. I believe there was a clause in there, a minor oversight, regarding the transfer of any assets acquired the signing of that trust." His eyes widened fractionally. He reached for the envelope, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. He pulled out the documents, his practiced composure beginning to fray. The meticulous financial projections, the market analysis, the growth plans I had painstakingly created over the last 2 years, they were all there. And, crucially, they were dated the trust was signed. The acquisition of new machinery, the expanded inventory, the preliminary contracts for the new market penetration, all were meticulously documented, all legally binding. I'd spent years building the business, and the last 2 years, in secret, building my case. My father, in his infinite arrogance, had assumed my silence was resignation. Instead, it had been observation. His face, usually so tanned and robust, paled. He scanned the documents, his breathing growing shallow. The spreadsheets scattered on his desk seemed to mock him. This is preposterous," he stammered, his voice a rough whisper. "You can't just—" "Actually, Dad," I interrupted, my tone still unervingly level, "I can. When you sell a business, you sell what it is at that moment. You don't sell its future potential. And you certainly don't sell future assets that weren't legally part of the initial transfer." I watched as the realization dawned on him, slow and agonizing. The smug entitlement in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a dawning panic. He had sold the business, yes, but he had also sold the future profits, the growth, the very essence of what he believed he was still controlling. And I, through a meticulous application of legal technicalities and a profound understanding of his own blind spots, had retained them. The sheer audacity of his betrayal had galvanized me, but it was the cold, precise application of law that would be his undoing. He looked at me, then back at the papers, his mind clearly racing, trying to claw back some semblance of control. He was a man who thought he'd sold a prize asset, only to discover he'd signed away its most valuable components. The fallout was, predictably, a symphony of frantic phone calls and veiled accusations. Sarah's texts came first, a barrage of confused exclamation points and demands for clarification. "What do you mean you kept the expansion plans? Dad said everything was included. Are you trying to cheat me?" My father's calls were more controlled, laced with a patronizing tone that he clearly believed would still work. "Michael, this is a family matter. We need to be reasonable. Let's sit down and work this out like adults." Adults. The word felt hollow coming from him. Then came the flying monkeys. My Aunt Carol, ever the loyal foot soldier, called, her voice dripping with disapproval. "Your father is devastated, Michael. He thought he was doing the right thing. You're causing such unnecessary distress to the family." I didn't engage. I simply let the silence speak for me. I didn't need to explain. The documents spoke for themselves. My father had boasted about his shrewdness, his business acumen, his ability to secure his family's future. Now, his shrewdness had backfired spectacularly. He'd sold the business, the legacy, the pride, for a quick payout and his daughter's fleeting gratitude. But he hadn't sold the future. He'd gifted it to me, unwittingly, by his own act of blatant favoritism. The whispers started to circulate. The small town where the business had been a fixture for decades wasn't known for its discretion. My father's generosity to Sarah, coupled with his sudden inability to answer basic financial questions about the sale, started to raise eyebrows. He'd promised Sarah a windfall, a life of luxury, but the expanded business, the very engine of its future success, now belonged to me. He had the cash from the sale, yes, but it was a finite amount, a lump sum that would dwindle. I, on the other hand, had the ongoing growth, the reinvestment, the very future of the enterprise he'd built. The man who had always valued the appearance of success over its substance was now facing a reality where his grand gesture had left him with a diminished present and a bleak, unscripted future. He had bet on Sarah's charm and his own perceived control, and he had lost everything that truly mattered. The satisfaction wasn't in the material gain, but in the quiet, undeniable proof that his own arrogance and my silent, meticulous strategy had created a perfect, and perfectly deserved, equilibrium. He had sought to erase me, and in doing so, had only cemented my place. The silence that now stretched between us was a vast, unbridgeable chasm, and in it, my father finally understood the true cost of his betrayal.